The first place the banks try to defend their short positions was at $50 because that's like a psychological level where investors have been watching silver for years and it's basically been in a very narrow price range. There was cost of storing silver. So people weren't incentivized, normal investors weren't incentivized to enter the silver market. But at $50, the banks knew those individual investors are going to get interested. Well, they did defend the price, so they threw everything, the banks threw everything they had at defending the $50 price, and the price did. It went down to $48, $47 for a very short while, but not for long. The price started surging again. And then, of course, when it got up to around the $67, because that was in 2008, with that financial crisis, COMEX set a limit that when the price got to $67, the banks had to cover their short position. That meant the banks had to find $681 billion. Then the next level the banks had to defend was $75, because at $75, they didn't have enough capital to cover the short positions. Yet again, the price of silver just blasted through $75. But when it hit $80, COMEX pulled the last arrow out of their quiver, and they basically tightened up the position on people holding shorts. In other words, they had to now come up with money which they didn't have. They'd run out of the money at the $67 level already. And despite the Federal Reserve pumping over $53 billion to try and protect the banks, even that wasn't enough. COMEX then, like I said, used the last quiver. They changed those levels, which forced the banks, which were holding those short positions, to sell their silver. But it wasn't silver they were selling. It was silver certificates. So what they did was they dumped a massive amount of silver certificates into the market, which isn't real silver. And that artificial supply, which was just silver certificates, for a very short time caused the price of silver to drop back down to $70 an ounce. But as soon as the market opened, that price surged, boom, back up to $85. And when it hit $85, COMEX suspended trade. But the great news for all of us who are holding silver is, yes, the COMEX price is artificial at 85, but the real price on the Tokyo exchange, the Shanghai exchange, etc., went well over $120 an ounce. So that's kind of what we can say is the real price of silver. But the biggest challenge facing COMEX right now is they've suspended trade. So it's like taking a pumped up, one of those beach balls and pushing it further and further and further and further underwater. In other words, as the gap between that $85 when they suspended trade and that $120 at the Tokyo and Shanghai exchange, as that grows bigger and bigger and bigger, when they finally remove the suspension or they release that ball, it is going to shoot miles out of the water. The price of silver is literally going postal. So what I would recommend, and I'm not a financial advisor, so this is just observations. It's not financial advice, but if I were you, if you can lay your hands on silver, even at $120, $150, I would grab it. I'm talking physical silver, not electronic silver or silver certificate. What's actually forcing the price of silver up is the fact that the dollar is dying. In other words, the dollar is basically losing value, but silver's retaining value. In other words, it's real, tangible value. So what you're really seeing in the silver price is an indication of what has happened in the financial markets, where way too much money has been printed, and this has basically left a massive deficit. So if we go on to, and you can go to usdebtclock.org, when the Federal Reserve Bank was created, price of silver back then, and I can tell you now, look on this. Right, so the price of silver back then was $2.66 per ounce, okay? But since then, the amount of money that's been printed and put into circulation, if you base a $2.66 silver price in 1913 and you add all the money that's been printed since then, the actual price of silver should be $1,181 per ounce. So like I say, if you can buy silver at $120, $150, I would grab it right now. I'm talking physical silver, right? Only physical silver that you've tested, because bear in mind, because there's such a shortage of silver, there's also going to be a lot of creatures out there that are going to try and sell artificial silver. So beware. Now is the time. The opportunity to buy silver, the gap is closing. If you can't get silver, then get XRP or XLM, which is backed by gold and silver. Like I said, I'm not a financial advisor, but if I were you, man, oh man, I would get out of the dollar. I would get out of the banks, because they're all going to fail very, very soon. Have a beautiful, beautiful day, everybody.